And that looks okay, doesn't it?
It looks great. Yep. Welcome everyone to welcome everyone to Roots Tech 2022. We are thrilled to have you, and we are excited to have Rob Spencer with us today, who will be sharing a class on extending time horizons with DNA. So I will turn the time to Rob, and at the end, we'll just go ahead and we'll wrap up, and we'll have some fun. So, great. Rob, take it away.
Wow. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. Originally, this was going to be 3 separate sessions, but Rhett and colleagues very generously allowed this to go live. And so we're going to do them all in 1 hour. And I think it probably makes it a little smoother, and we won't be derailed if maybe I make the request that we hold questions to the end. So with that, we'll just get going. Okay, here's our title, Extending Time Horizons with DNA. And time horizons, I mean seriously. We're going to do now. Okay, that's how that works. So first of all, many thanks. Many thanks to Rhett and his colleagues at Roots Tech for the opportunity to speak to you. Many thanks to FTDNA, Family Tree DNA, and Goran Runfeld, who's the head of their R&D, because these folks allow free access, generous access to their public haplotrees, which is the largest Y and mtDNA trees. And that's the data that I use for the tools that I make and the research that I do. I'm very grateful for that. Also, thanks David Langton and my colleagues at England EIJ Project over at FTDNA, where we have a very active blog and talk about all these things. I have colleagues, Maurice Gleason, Keith McGregor, Ian McDonald, all kinds of ideas, and Carlos Quiles and Shane Wilson for data. Anyway, later on, right now, if you're really quick with your QR code snapping, or at the end, you read this later, here's a QR code. It just takes you to the same URL that you see on the screen. There's all kinds of background information. The slides are there. There's background information. There's technical details, all kinds of stuff for your later perusal. Because this is going to be, well, in the past, I've been accused of running fire hose sessions. So this may be a fire hose of info. We'll see how that goes. You'll see this little motif, this little cartoon over and over and over again. I'll use it many times. It's our metaphor. That's you. Now, I don't know. Can you see the cursor? Anybody tell me, can you see my mouse moving around? Can I use that as a pointer?
Yeah, we do see it.
Let's get through the mouse.
Rob, we see your cursor, yes.
Oh, good, thanks. Okay, well, that's you down there in the red on the lower left. And in the traditional genealogical world, you'd want to explore up from you, up and backwards in time, going up your family tree. And the person just ahead of you might be a parent, grandparent, as far back as you can go. But at some point, you run out of paper trail, hit the proverbial brick wall. And in traditional DNA, that's kind of the end of the story. Traditional genealogy, end of the story. But our motif here is we're going to use DNA to jump sideways. We're going to do it at 3 different time frames, as you can see. We'll go into each of those in detail. And we're going to latch onto other bits of information. And then we'll use that to come back around to our ancestry, our ancestry, and fill it in now, not so much from bottom up, from the top down. So before we do that, we've got to back. I know there's a lot of DNA expertise, but there are a couple of things I'll go over very quickly that we need to know about DNA genealogy. First is the difference of the 3 types of DNA that are involved. Again, apologies in advance if this is old hat for a lot of people, but it'll be quick. The most common DNA type of testing that people do with respect to genealogy is called autosomal. That's what you get from MyHeritage, Ancestry DNA, Family Finder, FTDNA, and 23andMe. This tests all your chromosomes, well, all 23 of your chromosomes, the main part of your 99% of your DNA. And it's not gender specific. It looks at everybody. It looks at all your ancestries. But it only goes back about 250 years. So it goes back to the early 1800s in general. Maybe 6 generations, something like that. yDNA on your Y chromosome, men only, passed down father to son, father to son, father to son only. Or mtDNA, mitochondrial DNA, passed down mother to children, all the way down, only through the female line. If autosomal DNA is like a candle, it's kind of a short traveling light, but it goes in all directions. These other 2 are like laser pointers. They go a tremendous distance, but they cover a very small part of your ancestry. But because that's the only thing that Mother Nature gives us, that's what we use. So these have a scope going back to the beginnings of species, actually even further, 200,000 years. And they have time resolutions we'll talk about maybe in the question and answer if we get to it. But the main thing I'm going to do is talk briefly about autosomal, but that's really well covered by lots of other people in other sessions and big company websites like Ancestry, DNA, and so forth. Most of the time, I'm going to be working with yDNA. My only slide here on cheesy advertising is the only cheesy advertising I do. Everything I do is free. I'm a retired professional biochemist and data scientist. This is my retirement hobby. It's great fun. There's lots of data available. And everything I do is free. And here are the tools that I have, which are reasonably popular. SNP Tracker allows you to see your paths. We'll have this at the end. We'll show some examples of that. Allows you to see your personal mitochondrial or yDNA out of Africa track, in many cases right down to the present day, which is kind of remarkable. SURNAME mapper and things that take advantage of Anglo-Irish census data from the late 1900s. That will, again, we'll have a little more on that at the end, will allow us to focus in. It augments the DNA data, and because it taps to surnames, and in our society, surnames often go with the male line, it synergizes really rather nicely. There's a tree explorer. You can explore the SNP haplotree or mitochondrial tree fairly clearly in a way, and a clustering we won't get into too much. It gets a little more technically complex. Okay, so what are we going to do in this first session where we're only using mostly using autosomal, and we're only going back within the scope of traditional genealogy. We're going to look for specific ancestors, and we're going to talk about jumping brick walls to identify those common ancestors, jumping over gaps. Here's another version of our cartoon, and I'm introducing a little nomenclature, kind of in the same way that we have micro and macroeconomics. It doesn't mean bigger or smaller. It kind of means the nature of the focus and the nature of information. What I'm calling microgenealogy is traditional paper genealogy. It's focused on, it stalls at the first unknown. It works from bottom up. When you hit the brick wall, the story kind of stops. You can't go any farther. In this talk, just to use the words to emphasize it, I'm going to introduce you to a term of macrogenealogy. Like macroeconomics, this pulls in all kinds of other disciplines. It pulls in genealogy, genetic genealogy, demographics, archaeology, all kinds of things. It tends to be top down and allows you to jump over gaps. So here's that cartoon again, and this first little session, we're just going to talk about that first yellow loop. We're going to go up the little stick figures there that are filled in dark gray, typically are ones where you can possibly know an exact person's name, you know, specific persons. You'll see there are also a lot of little figures there in outline. Those show that in the other sessions a little later, we'll be talking about people. There are things about them we know, but we may not know them personally. But in this case, we often will know by name. So here's what we do. So this is my only example of autosomal. I know you'll see this in other talks, and you've probably seen it for yourself. At this point, about 35 million people, almost all in North America, have done some autosomal DNA testing for the purpose of genealogy. And if you're like me, and like most people, you'll find that you have hundreds of 4th to 6th cousins. I can't help you much more anymore than the vendor websites. If you put in your own tree, they're really very good. Here are 2 snapshots for myself. This is the one we can all get into, right, without a password problem, which is our own data. And I'm the little blob shown there in the red arrow in both cases. And because I've put in a fair bit of the paper tree that I know, these websites, one is 23andMe and one is Ancestry DNA, they're able to connect that with other people's trees and assemble a tree for me. Okay, and the DNA goes along with the ride, and that's how they know the cousinship and all the rest. No, I'm not saying it very well. You see the explosion of as you go out further in your cousins, which is to say backwards in time to grandparents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents. I have 5 or 7, depending which company I test with, second cousins, about 30 third cousins, and 14 to 1,500 fourth cousins. That's pretty typical. Now, if you want to do that, that's great. Like I said, I'm not here to help you with this. Other people will do that. There's a lot of skill and expertise, and the vendor websites are getting better and better every day. But we're going to do some different stories, and I'm going to try and move that little thing on my screen there. So it's in my way a little bit. Let it go. So from now on, I'm going to keep talking about the near term, but we're going to use yDNA. In particular, ySTR, short tandem repeat. It's just a type of DNA. It's what most everybody started out with maybe 10 or even 15 years ago, because it's what's used for DNA and forensic for police use. It's fairly inexpensive to do. And the company that does the most of this, which FTDNA, calls a match, and this is all about men now, because it's on the Y chromosome. A match is a man with whom you have a common ancestor within the past about 600 years. They don't tell it, they express it that way, but when you work out how they do their matching, that's what it means. About 25 generations, 22 generations, about 600 years. When I did YSTR testing a couple of years ago now, my dad had been very interested in it. He had gone to Salt Lake years ago to go through the microfilm in the archives of the church, the best in the world, of course, at holding on to this kind of information. And what he filled in a whole family tree back to our first immigrant ancestor on the male side, but with one gap. Well, lucky me, sadly, he's passed away now. But in 2 weeks, with a simple, inexpensive DNA test, and of course, the power of the internet to search now, I figured that out in less than 2 weeks. Here again, I'm on the arrow in that table. It's a mysterious looking table of lots of numbers. And what happens to be here is I have a whole bunch of very close matches. All the little numbers are very, very close to mine. That's what it looks like. But let's do a little more than that. And here's where some of my software comes in. If I take those numbers, I can produce a little family tree. That's that squiggly line up at the top called a dendrogram. This is the same people you saw in that table. And here I am again, this red arrow. This is a very characteristic pattern. You see that line that comes down from more than 30 generations ago, it comes down to about 20, then has this curvy line intersecting, a halfway point is about 10 generations ago. This is extremely common and almost always the signature of a single immigrant who came to North America. And these are everybody in that group descends from that exact person. It's a family tree in a way, okay? But this is entirely built out of the DNA data. We can go further and analyze. I won't go into all the math. I like that stuff. But we can do an analysis of the time to that common ancestor, TMRCA, time to most recent common ancestor. And we can say that person was born around 1560. And we can put error bars on it. And this is a curve showing you there's theory and curve fit. And it's actually very, very good for this kind of data now. Well, guess what? There's a punchline. It's on the bottom for me. And this is what I figured out very quickly. It fits perfectly with a fellow, other people's paper, not mine. This is the key thing. Other people had paper trail. I matched by DNA, but they had the paper. And they found a guy named Gerard Spencer who lived in Stotfold, Bedfordshire, England, between 1576 to 1646, who had 4 sons who emigrated to the American colonies in 1630. Well, between all the names, between the dates, between the single immigrant pattern and the DNA, it's a dead ringer. And this is my ancestor. Okay, I can piggyback because the enormous confidence in the DNA and all these patterns and the dates, I can say with complete confidence that is one of my paternal line ancestors. Okay, so let's just get into a couple of other themes that I think are fascinating. And I know from working with an active blog on one of the FTDNA groups, a lot of people don't necessarily know these things, and they're important when you do DNA genealogy. You probably all know that surnames arose in Europe, and most of us here, we're talking about European descent, in the 11th to 13th centuries. And that sets a limit for traditional genealogy in many cases. yDNA can go way past that. So because we're going to go past that, we have to reconsider some of our assumptions based on surname genealogy. Now, here again is an analysis. This is I picked at random a common surname, Carter. And I did my clustering, DNA clustering, and all the data from the Carter surname project. In the yellow box, you see American immigrant family. This is backwards in time going up, and we see that little curvy pattern. Each little dot on the bottom is a man who did DNA testing. This is the signature of the American immigrant family. All the people here, I'm moving my cursor around, descend from a single man, almost certainly named Carter. who came to the United States, and I can look at that myself, and I know how to read this, and I can say probably 8 generations ago, more or less. Okay, that blue line I've drawn across the diagram is about 25 generations ago, and that's when surnames arose. So here's a guy over here, and there are lots of these single lines. This guy has no matches. His name is Carter, but he is not related to these Carters. Why? Because his line goes back before there were surnames. In fact, and so there's a lot of different lines here of Carter. Here's another little family group. Here's another little family group. Here's another immigrant family group. A lot more singletons. Somebody with only a couple of relatives named Carter. In general, and you can ask me more in the questions. We can go into some of the research if you care. But it's very true. It's almost universally true. In any collection of n men, you'll find about n/2 distinct lineages. And by lineage, I mean you have no common ancestor within the time that surnames arose. I'm choosing to slice off the tree of man, if you will, at the time that surnames arose. So if you have 100 men, you'll find about 50 distinct lineages. A lot of people think that anybody named Abernathy, we must be related if I'm an Abernathy. It's not true. You certainly know it isn't true for Smith. In fact, it's almost universally the fact that 100 men, you'll have about 50 distinct lineages. Okay, let's go back to surnames a little bit and something you need to think about NPEs. In the pattern at the top, I have a whole bunch of lows, and again, this is generated one of these DNA patterns. And there's one fellow named Kempston. Well, all the lows and Kempstons here are co-descend from within the boundary of surname creation. So it's pretty likely this represents an immigrant pattern from somebody named Lowe. And this fellow named Kempston probably is a result of an NPE somewhere since, in this case, we can see the dates, probably colonial times. So it probably is an NPE, why that fellow has the name Kempston. But you have to be careful. On the bottom here, we have a pattern of 3 Boyds and somebody named Waugh. But their common ancestry goes back over 40 generations. At that point in time, nobody had surnames. So in this case, their surnames are different, not because there's an NPE. We have no right to assume that, no reason to assume that. They have different names because nobody had a name. And when the Norman knight came to town and said, "What's your name?" and assigned them surnames, if they didn't have them, they got different names. It's as simple as that. Okay. Another common thing we said is, why can't I find my European ancestors? Well, if you did autosomal DNA, it only reaches back to about 1800. And if your immigrant ancestor arrived before then or was born before then, you simply can't do it with autosomal. But another thing I want to point out that we run into, again, with a reach of yDNA, is North American population growth. You can look up population data. It's pretty easy. And I've shown on the left in a log scale, the population of the American colonies, later the United States, of course, 1783, and Britain. And what we see is, and this is only non-Native Americans, because sadly, we don't have data for them, but of the immigrants, from 1650 to about 1850, the United States had the most amazing population growth rate ever seen in anything I've ever done in looking through population demographics, doubling time of only 24 years. On average, an immigrant at this time had 4.7 children, a couple, a man and a woman, would have nearly 5 children survive to adulthood and become parents themselves. Where in England at the time, or anywhere in Europe at the time, it was barely 2. 2 people would have like 2.05 or 2.1 children survive, just barely growing. This is enormous. The reason why, as you can see at the bottom, is because although life was certainly hard in the colonies, what we didn't have was plague, smallpox, syphilis, typhus, and cholera, which are diseases that have built up in urban areas. It was amazingly different. So what this means is, if there's a fellow in black at the top right who has 2 sons in 1650, one son stays in Britain. And from 1650 to 1880, that fellow will end up having 4 male descendants on average. That growth rate curve I showed you in the previous slide. But the one who goes to North America will have 800. This is astounding. The growth rate difference over the time period of over 230 years will be 200 more descendants. This is why if you have 10 matches in your DNA and they're all from North America, well, I should have some Brits in there, or Germans or French. No, you don't have them because they simply don't exist. Because of death in infancy and all kinds of other things, they simply didn't have the population explosion. The people aren't there. It's not that they don't DNA test; they're just not there. So I thought I want to point that out to you Because a lot of people worry about their European connections and think it's because somebody who's not testing. It's a little tougher. It's because they aren't there. Okay, so do it yourself. Ending up the first session. We're going quickly here. If you want to do this kind of thing, by all means, do autosomal testing. And I would recommend one of the bigger testers. Why? Because they have bigger databases and they're more likely to find matches, and they're listed there. By all means, add your own family, your own tree to the vendor's website. Use their tools to filter matches. They're really excellent tools. See if that answers your questions. Contact people. They all have contact me and chat sessions to see if their paper trails are more detailed and can help you out. And there's a link there to some other resources for autosomal testing. And if your unknowns are male line or they lived before 1800, then do yDNA testing. End of session 1. Okay, we're right on time and we are going to jump. Next session here, we're going to go back farther in time. Here's my cartoon again. This time, we're going to go this middle yellow circle. Okay, once again, I'm looking to understand my dotted line going up the left side. I'm looking for my ancestry, but I'm stuck. I jump out to DNA. I've done my autosomal. I've learned what I can. Now, I want to go into a realm of history where I may not have paper records. I want to intersect my line here, maybe 1,000 years ago, and I won't have paper trail then. I probably will have surnames on the male line. I might, if I'm lucky, but I probably won't have paper. And I'm going to need the results of people I cannot put names to. And then I've called this one finding clans and families. Connections are too distant for paper genealogy or autosomal DNA. So we're going to use tools. Remember the sense of macrogenealogy. We're going to use other kinds of tools, surnames, DNA, and census locations. So I'm going to do this in 3 stories. The best way to do this is with 3 stories. And the first story turns out to be a relatively simple story of 2 surnames, Morrison and McCown. I came on this by chance, and it's a lovely, compact little story. So if I do my STR DNA analysis business, I generate these, they're called dendrograms, but they're basically family trees. And on the left, I have this diagram. You can't see it. That's fine. In detail of Morrison, and here's one of McCown. Remember I said if I have 100 men, I have 50 different clades. I'm using the clade to mean not related within surname times. There may be more than 20 clades for sure here of Morrisons. And there are at least 3 smaller databases of McCowns, at least 3 clades. And they look like they're unrelated. If I go on the site here, I'm a Morrison, I find my Morrisons, I'm very happy with that. And the same thing with the McCowns, I'm very happy with that. But when I take the Morrison McCowns and I put the data together and I co-analyze it, something really wonderful jumps out. The 2 that I've circled in the pink boxes are in fact connected. They had a common ancestor who lived about 32 or so generations ago. In other words, about 940 AD. There is no doubt about this. We don't know this person's name, this man's name. He was a real guy. He was born around 940 AD. And his descendants, one side ended up taking surname Morrison, and another side ends up taking surname McCown. Remember, surnames don't appear until about 20 to 25 generations ago. So this guy at the beginning in 940 AD, he doesn't have a surname. He's just Joe Nothing. We don't know his name. But he begets McCowns and Morrisons. But now we can tell a story. And this is a story about these people that he didn't know before. And this is what I think is so much fun about this. This is jumping out of the box. We can put a story to that and tell it with a little map. Now, there are other things we'll know. You'll get some hints later about the paternal path of these people, entering the British Isles 2500 BC, and probably in Scotland, and we know that from the names, around 940 AD, a man has 2 sons. One has descendants who will later take the surname Morrison. The other's descendants take the surname McCown, and they move to Ireland. And I drew a line there from somewhere probably in southern Scotland to Northern Ireland. Each of them has a descendant, and we can put dates. Remember, we can use those. We can get dates out of the DNA, estimated dates of when their ancestors would have gone to North America. And we know most of those men on the previous diagram, as I've showed you, most DNA testers are North American. So around 1720, 1730, each of these clades separately, they don't know each other at all, have sons who go to the colonies, and they have large families, and some of those families do DNA testing. Now we can guess on the history And then I'm guessing about 1610. And I'm guessing it might be, and this is the kind of thing where DNA gives you a clue that you can pursue with paper. It could well be that the McCown, we'll call them the Irish branch, were as part of the Ulster plantations under James I, which is a pretty nasty part of history, but you can look it up. And a couple, 100,000 plus, as I recall, poor Scots were transplanted more or less against their will in Northern Ireland for political, religious, and economic purposes. And many of them later, it was pretty miserable. Many of them later, as soon as they could, left for the new American colonies. But that's a problem. Certainly the DNA story is very clear there. Okay. Now we're going to expand the same new story. Now this time we have 5 surnames. So I looked at these different surname projects in the bottom. 5 different names: Dunbar, Coburn, Preston, Riddle, and Rutherford. And if you look them up and you look on the family tree websites where they have the public DNA pages, people list down their earliest known ancestor, which is great. It's very, very helpful. And the best one I found for in the Dunbar list of all the men named Dunbar was a Robert Dunbar, born 1634. For Coburn, there's an Alexander de Coburn, about 1300 AD. Preston, William Preston, 1790, and so forth. And this is what the people know. And when you sign up for that, you think, that's great. Gee, I know my ancestry. The DNA tells me I'm related to this bunch of Dunbars. So my earliest known ancestor is Robert Dunbar. Aha. But you now know we're not going to stop there. Look what happens when we co-analyze these people. Now, on the right-hand side, I'm showing you the tools I described earlier. This is a view of the yDNA tree, the way I like to present it, because I'm showing you all the surnames. And here's a SNP. It's called RZP2. And under it, we have SNPs ZP78, S5443, and so forth. And look at the names: Dunbar, Rutherford, Preston, Dunbar, Coburn. Now it splits. Dunbar, Coburn splits into Dunbar, separate from Coburn. There's some Osborns in there too. When I throw all their DNA together and I do this analysis for date, I get, again, a gorgeous fit over on the left, which is theory matching experiment, which tells us these all descend under ZP2 from a common ancestor, and we can put a date somewhere around 1100 AD. So all these separate lines of Dunbars, Rutherfords, Preston, not all Dunbars, but some of the Dunbars, remember, some of the Rutherfords, some of the Prestons, and we know which ones by DNA, all had a common ancestor around 1140 AD. We can do a little more. If we take all those names, and another one of my tools, cheesy advertising, it's all free. But if you look at those names in the 1881 British and Irish censuses, and you look where Riddell, Coburn, Rutherford, Dunbar, and Preston are, look at that. I mean, it doesn't get any simpler, any clearer, that hits you up the head of what is the probable case. If the DNA says these people had a common ancestor, where would that common ancestor have lived? Well, there it is. It's in the southeast Scotland or northeast England. Okay, so the borders region of Riddell, Coburn, Rutherford, Dunbar, and Preston. So these 5 lines, what was shown is these 5 lines, there's massive evidence, an overlapping of location from the census data. The DNA clearly ties them together. And I'm not going to go any further with this, but if I were in one of those groups and had one of these DNA lineages, I would want to find my colleagues of those other names. I didn't know they existed. I didn't know they connected to me before. If I were named Riddell, I'd want to find that somebody named Coburn and share everything that they knew. Remember, they all had their earliest known ancestors of the different names. I'd want to compare notes, because it may well be, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if they could actually have some hypotheses of who might that person have been who lived in around 1140 by name, because each of them has separate paper trails. Bring them together, collaborate, find out what you know. And that's this more advanced sense of jumping over and then working top down, combining paper trails from different histories and different family archives to find out something more about your deeper ancestry. And my last story in this session, take another sip, called Descendants of a Legendary King. Now, I'm not personally big on what I call king fishing, but a lot of people are. And the good reason to do things like king fishing, which is to say attach oneself to a historic figure like a king, is because that's where the data is. I mean, face it, aristocratic families, when all your wealth and power passes down through a genealogical line, through a family line, well, you tend to keep good records. And that's fine. I'm a data nut, so it's fine with me. Now, I pulled this tree on the right out of Wikipedia, and I can't defend it. I won't. It's perfectly reasonable to me, and good enough for us. There was a fellow named King Alpin, lived between 830, 840 AD or so. That's what must have been when he reigned. Born around 800 AD then. And he's the last king of the Picts, a Scottish tribe famous for, causing havoc with the Romans and later on. One of his sons there, King Kenneth I, is typically called the first king of the Scots. So this is an important time in Scottish history when it starts to have an identity. What I'm focusing on are the names. So look at the names. I see Donald, I see Gregor, I see McNabb, I see a McGregor, I see McKinnon, McPhee, Macaulay, Grant, Macquarie. The legend is, and I'll call it legend at the moment, is that all these, and there is paper evidence for this and oral traditional evidence, that these clans, McGregor, Macaulay, McPhee, McKinnon, McNabb, Macquarie, all descend from this small family under King Alpin, sons, grandsons, and so forth, as you see. Question, can we identify modern descendants? With what kind of confidence? So what I did was I looked for the surnames. Now, when you do yDNA, FTDNA, you can optionally attach your surname to it, and it's wonderful when you do. So I looked for all 45,000 SNPs, and I'm a computer programmer, so I just programmed this up. It's quick. I looked through all 45,000 SNPs to see if any of them, which of them had any of these 7 historic names. And the answer was that only 119 had any of them. And that's going across there. These are all the DNA markers going across. These are SNPs going across left to right. And only these 119 had any mention of the names McGregor, McKinnon, Grant, Macaulay, and so forth. That's it. And there's only 4 that have more than one. And I've blown them up here in the bottom right. RL1335, RL1065, and so forth. And they have McGregor, McKinnon, and Grant. Wow. Not only that, but these SNPs, L1335 and so forth, are descendants of each other. They're really the same line. We're just looking at it at different places. So here we have on the tree, 1335, 1065, 744. It's the same lineage. So what we have is a single lineage, the only one, and that's important, the only one that has 3 of our 7 key names. That's getting interesting. Now, if we use STR data, there's more of it, and the reason is simple. STR testing is less expensive, and many more men have done it. I can find all 7 names. Here's a great big dendrogram for L1335. I know you can't read it, but in the very fine print, and I've highlighted them all, you can find 1 or more examples of McPhees, McNabbs, McGregors, McKinnons, Macquaries, Grants, and Macaulays. All of them. There are others in there too. There's also Stewarts and Campbells and Rogers and other names. Okay? That's because Scottish history is terribly turbulent. This is a long period of time we're talking about, from 800 AD on to the present. And Scottish history is very turbulent. People change names with alliances, political and economic alliances. So it's not surprising. But nonetheless, what I've got is a very compelling case that this is a lineage almost beyond coincidence that goes back to King Alpin. So we can also date it. If you've seen me do this before, I do my mathematical analysis. I can put a date to 1335. It comes out to around 840 again, around 840 AD. All right. Now, so again, as we did in the previous cases, we've got 3 lines of evidence. We've got surnames linked to DNA, in this case, 7 of them. We've got a DNA date around 840. And we've got location. On the bottom, here's my map, and here are those names, McGregor, McKinnon, Macquarie, McNabb, all in the west coast to the Highlands of Scotland. So again, it's not proof, but it's far better than any other lineage. And I looked through what did I say? 45,000 SNPs. It's far better than any other Y lineage we have, by massively more probable that these men who have this marker, L1335, are descendants of King Alpin, because it's just like overwhelming coincidence. Again, I'll point out, it's not every McGregor. A third of McGregors, 30%, have 1335. Only 3% of Macaulays. Only 13% of McNabbs. So it's not everybody. Well, let's be silly about it. 15% of men named Grant have 1335. Oh, you and I, of a certain generation, know a man named Grant who certainly isn't 1335, and that's a fellow named Cary Grant, because he was born Archibald Leach and changed that for Hollywood purposes to a much nicer, sexier name, Cary Grant. That's a little silly, but it's just showing you that names change, and they don't necessarily go along with the DNA. So we have a good case here for back to our prehistoric Scottish king. So do it yourself. If you want to do this kind of thing, there's no guarantees. It all depends on luck, on other people doing DNA testing. But we're really in a golden age of DNA testing. So there's more data than ever. It's doubling every few years. Family tree DNA is by far the largest operation that does yDNA testing. It's more expensive. It's more specialized. I would absolutely recommend their Big Y product if you're really interested in this. I would join the project for your surname. There are projects there. There are admins there. It's a very active back and forth thing. That's what I do, where I connect with people and ask in their online forum. It's very good. And of course, you can look at some of my tools if you have Anglo-Irish paternal ancestry. And again, it's not that I have a particular thing for Anglo-Irish. That's where the data are. I've got really good census data for them. And so that's why that focus. So do it yourself, by all means. So that's end of session 2. We're moving fast enough for everybody. Now we really turn back the clock, and I'm definitely going to leave time for questions, and I hope we have good ones. Now we're going to go back 200,000 years. Hold on to your hat. We're going to go way too far back in time for any family records. Forget the idea of paper trail, forget surnames, forget written history. We're going way back before then. A couple of minutes ago, I was talking about some stories that were men who lived in 800 AD to 1000 AD to 1100 AD. That's going to seem recent now. We're going back way before. Well, what can you learn back there? Well, why do you care? Well, you explore it. It's still part of your heritage. You can learn, among other things, and you'll see in a moment, some of the great migrations of humankind. And you can know with precision which migration, at least the paternal line, remember it's just this laser pointer, one particular line, but unambiguously true if you've done the Y testing, where they came from and when they did. So our tools are now going to be yDNA, both ancient and modern, archaeology, and geometry and math, but I hide that for you in the software. So here's our picture again. Again, here you are, the bottom left. You want to explore your ancestry going up. Now your DNA is going to take you out to a whole a tower of people going back 3,000 plus years. We don't know any of their names. They had names up to a point, or they had first names. But now we're going to look at archaeology, history, and ancient DNA. Those are our tools. Now you've almost certainly seen drawings like this. I made a simplified cartoon of it. This is the stuff of textbooks. It's wonderful. This is our out of Africa. Everybody knows Homo sapiens arises in Africa, as we'll call, more or less modern Homo sapiens. We know the lines now, of course, between us and Neanderthals and Denisovans are blurry. We're not separate species, we're subspecies. But what we'll call our main line of Homo sapiens arises in Africa, maybe 240,000 years ago. And then branches go in every which way. There are major out of Africa events 50 to 70,000 years ago into the Fertile Crescent, not named that for a very good reason. We hang around there in many lines of humankind, stay there for a very long time because it's a great place to be. And then other lines go down to Oceania. Others go across Asia over to the Americas on the land bridge during the last ice age, when this was dry land, down Beringia into North and South America. Some go up and across the top. We'll see a specific example of that we can follow. And others go to Europe in a couple of different ways. These broad paths are well known. Now, if you've done the Y or mtDNA, we can make it personal. Your exact path and when and details. But I'll talk to you a little bit about building a tree, because what we need to do now, or at least it's helpful to understand, is we talk about the tree of man. I've shown you tree diagrams. How is that constructed? The best way, again, is an example. If you do a DNA test, a so-called SNP test like Big Y, what you get back is sometimes confusing to people. And what you'll get back is a list of the markers or the SNPs that you have. And then maybe the list of ones that you don't have. And that's it. on the left. So let's take our little example here. Adam, Bob, and Chris are three guys, and they do DNA testing, and they get back the results. All of them have marker BY1. Adam and Bob have BY2, and Bob alone has BY3. Well, so what? Well, I challenge you to get out pencil and paper and play around with it. There's no easy way to express this as a set of rules, although it can be, of course, it's coded in software. But there's only one tree that will accommodate that result. They all three have BY1. So whoever their common ancestor is had to have BY1 before any of them split apart. And so BY1 is at the top of this tree. Chris doesn't have BY2, so he branches off somewhere early. And Adam and Bob have BY2, so they join together at BY2, but only Bob has BY3. You get the idea, okay? So this table of markers, who has them and who doesn't, can be constructed into a tree. FTDNA does this, and some other firms do this on a regular basis. They update maybe every day, certainly every couple of weeks, and update what you can call, if you want to call it, the tree of man. Now, here's what the tree looks like in a little more detail. Why Adam was a real person. It's not meant to be a flippant name, and the scientists are, they got their light moments. Why Adam, I'll tell you who he was. He was a real guy. He changes around with the data. What he is, in technical terms, he's the first man, this is a man because it's Y chromosome, who had two sons, at least two sons, and those two sons had the property that both of them have descendants who have survived to the modern day and done DNA testing. That's what it means to be Y Adam, which is kind of technical, but you can understand that all the branches, when you add up all of our branches, they come back to the common ancestor. And he lived about 240,000 years ago. We can do that all the way down the tree. And because there's a big bias in this tree, we have to say, because we're North Americans, Americans do most of the DNA testing in the world. There are probably a lot of testers in China and Japan, but we don't share data, or at least the companies do it, or different companies. So we're missing out on mostly everybody in China, Southeast Asia, Africa, and India. So this is heavily European bias. It's just the nature of DNA testing at the moment and the available data. But we see that there's a big out of Africa event around 50,000 years ago, like I said. And then these lines go down. Some go Nordic, some go Finnish. There's a big R1b branch here, the so-called Yamnaya. It's a great big deal. They end up sweeping through Europe with their yDNA, leaving big Germanic swaths, Iberian, and British Isles. Let's focus on the British Isles, show you what a tree looks like in more detail. RL21. Now I've colored it by Scottish, Irish, or English in the colors you can see on the legend. This is everybody in RL21. Some branches, at some point you get down here and it goes from being a muddy blur to getting colorful, green, Irish. Some of these are Irish, which means these ancestries land and stay in Ireland. They don't mix anymore outside the island. Blue, Scottish. England's a little muddier. Well, England mixes a lot faster and has many more historic invasions. We're talking a long time period here than the others. It's not as insular, literally, as those islands. And when we come down to the bottom, we intercept the time when surnames arose. And with some of these markers, I've just sketched out some on the bottom here. 1335 Alpin, we talked about him. 222 O'Neills. A lot of O'Neills are 222. A lot of O'Briens are 226. Camerons, FT 5737, and so forth. And these little dots at the bottom are specific men, or SNPs. We can identify with exact men, and we intersect the paper trail. So that you think that tree of man is kind of, I don't know, a big abstraction that doesn't matter. In many, many cases, more than ever, there's so much testing going on now. Many of us, myself included, I can tie myself back out of Africa because I can identify my Gerard Spencer of Stottsville, Bedfordshire with a DNA marker and all the way to the tree, all the way back specifically. That's what's fun. Here's how that works. Y Adam, we know, is in Africa, about 240,000 BC. Now, there happens to be a skeleton that was dug up, ancient DNA. He was named Malta Boy out in Siberia, I don't know, 20, 30 years ago. His bones have since been tested. He lived around 22,000 years ago, and they have certain DNA markers. We know he descends from the African markers. Then there's steppe herders. We have a lot of archaeology again, present-day Ukraine. Terrible story. They're modern. But steppe herders are there around 4,500 BC. They have markers that are later in time, so we know 2 goes to 3, and we know where that ancient DNA is. And then we also have markers for M222, just to pick one, in Northern Ireland, around 2000 BCE. So doing this over and over and over again in more and more and more detail, we can put a map to the time to the DNA. I'm going to cut through this. We can also do error analysis, which I like to be kosher in the science here, and we can say what the uncertainty are. Here are the circles in the bottom. We don't know this with great precision, but we can put some kind of precision circles, error circles on these. We also have, many thanks to Carlos Quiles, who has laboriously archived and collected at least 12,000 from the literature, 12,000 records of ancient DNA samples. He hasn't done the archaeology, but he's collected the data in a nice way. And here are the ones I make use of all across Eurasia. Now let's just finish up with a few examples. I think I have 3 of these, and then we're all done. So I just picked past the Isle of Man. I picked the Isle of Man because it's a little tiny island between Ireland and Britain. So you could very easily, and I don't know where the fellows live there. I've gotten to know a couple of guys in the Isle of Man. You and your 2 neighbors living on this lovely, charming small island have known each other from childhood, but until DNA, you might not have known that your paternal lines have taken 3 enormously different paths through history. All come out of Africa. One branched here. One fellow's paternal line branched here. The solid line gets up in the purple. The Paleolithic gets to Europe fairly early. These are the people. They're following the glaciers. The ice age is receding ahead of them. And that ends up in the Isle of Man. Another goes way out. Remember Malta Boy? That's how we peg this line out into Mongolia near Lake Baikal. They're out there again. These are hunter-gatherers in the Paleolithic. They may come across different lines, take different paths into Europe. So you may be right next to your neighbor and have known each other for years, but your ancestral paternal paths can differ by thousands of miles and thousands of years. And now, thanks to the DNA, you can know it and you can verify it. Here's another one. These are just, I just picked these arbitrarily, 2 different ways to get to Spain. There are many, many. I just picked 2 that illustrate rather nicely. Again, we see this about 60-70% of European men descend from this path that goes out to Mongolia, around the Caspian Sea, over the top of the Black Sea, up the Danube River. 60% of men in Europe have this line of descent. It's called R1b. But there are also lines in Spain. I happen to be haplogroup E. In this case, probably came up the Nile in the Paleolithic, hunter-gatherers, across northern Africa, and then up into Spain that way. And paths to Finland, again, if you know Finns, ethnically, roughly speaking, there are two big chunks of Finland. There's the southwest, which is from Sweden, and there's the northeast, which is from Asia. And again, the DNA shows this beautifully clearly. The N branch, which is the Finns are nuts for testing. They're lovely people. Very worldly, intelligent, and great people. I met my wife in Helsinki, as a matter of fact. But they do a lot of DNA testing, and they have an almost unique path across, again, to the up through the Bronze Age, through the upper steppes, the northern reaches of what is now Russia, into Finland. And again, they have some of these old European paths. We can also use census data. I mentioned, finishing up here. In some cases, again, for Anglo-Irish, I picked a good name where this works very well with is Moriarty. If you were surname Moriarty and you had BY17874, actually just to be the DNA marker, it would be a very good bet that your ancestry comes from County Kerry. Why? Because it just so happens that Moriarty is almost unique to County Kerry. There are very few Moriartys in the 19th century anywhere but there. A few in London, a few in Liverpool. They probably went there for jobs. But if you back that up and do the math right, it's really focused on Kerry. And that's true of many surnames, actually, more than you'd think, are localizable. And once you do that and do that for each snip along the way, you can draw a pretty confident path for this person's paternal ancestry right down to the county level. Okay, do it yourself. Do yDNA, our mitochondrial DNA testing. Do FTA's Big Y700 if you want the most detail. Enter your haplogroup, and for British and Irish ancestry, these are my tools. Go have a look, try it out. So we are done. And thank you so much for your time. I know that was a bit of a quick business. So I'm going to go back to Rhett, and he can tell me how this works.
All right. Thank you very much, Rob. That was awesome. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. We have some questions in the chat. If you want to take some, I can read them to you.
Yeah, why don't you read them to me rather than have me fool around?
Sure, absolutely.
And I'll come back over time if we don't, and I know I can pick these up over time.
Okay, great. So there's a question. What about American and Canadian First Nations? And that's from Gail.
Right.
Gail, does that give you enough information, or do we need her to come up?
Yeah, I'm guessing. First, I think I'd probably refer you to Roberta Estes. I don't know her, I've met her, but who's probably done as much as anybody I've ever seen with Native American DNA work. I know in general, we're learning more and more, people like David Reich at Harvard Med School, collaborating with many others. Of course, I know there's very reasonable historic reluctance of some North American tribes to DNA test, but others there's not. And so we're filling in the blanks on the broad strokes, not personalized, but of migration-wise, not even tribal, pre-tribal, ancient stuff. And we know better and better. For example, I remember this one paper of how the Caribbean was populated the first time by native peoples. They come around the Bering Land Bridge, go around, and they don't come across Florida, which had been thought. The DNA is really quite clear. They come up to what is now Venezuela, Trinidad and Tobago, and so forth. And this is ancient DNA is telling us that. That's about all I can do. Again, the testing is slight. I know it's a matter of personal choice.
All right, thank you. And Roberta Estes is teaching a class on Native American ancestry here at Roots Tech, so you can find that in the directory. Next question is from Elaine, and her question is, can you speak about yDNA testing for Ashkenazi Jews?
By all means, do it. There are big communities about it. It can certainly help with, I mean, we all know in the Jewish community, much like Afro-Americans, surnames got mangled for a variety of reasons. Often none of them terribly pretty, but we live with that today. So DNA can help cut you through some of the times when surnames were obligatorily abandoned or changed. So I would heartily recommend yDNA. Again, I can't speak to it with much personal experience, but there are big communities out there for yDNA work in Ashkenazi and Sephardic communities.
Okay, awesome, thank you. Let's see, there's a question here that I can just answer. They're asking, people are asking if the class is being recorded and when it will be available to review. And yes, we are recording it, and it will be available for reviewing tomorrow. It'll just take us a little bit of time to process it and get it onto the site. So this will be available tomorrow. Okay. Let's see. Are there any other questions that I've missed in the chat? Anyone just go ahead and put them in here. We've got a few more minutes so we can go.
Fire away, folks.
Sally's at okay. Bill and Andy are saying, what does STR stand for?
Short tandem repeat. How much detail do you want?
At a very beginner level, what is it, a STR?
An STR. Well, first let me explain what a SNP is, because there are two different types of testing for yDNA. A SNP is what you think of as a traditional mutation. Cosmic ray comes down, oxidative damage happens, bam, one of your DNA bases is changed. Either repair mechanisms come along, they fix it, but they fix it with a different base. So an A will turn to a T or so forth. That's a SNP. And those happen at a certain rate and so forth. And they're basically locked in then. And so they don't change, which is why we can go back in time so far. STRs are a funny different beast. Short tandem repeats, they're little pieces of DNA, typically 4 long, like think of ATTA. Okay, maybe there's a sequence ATTA. It might repeat in a little piece of your DNA. It'll repeat like 10 times. It's a tongue twister. ATTA, ATTA, ATTA. Get the idea. That's what the DNA looks like. There's these little repeating patterns. And the number of patterns, let's say there were 10 of those, like 10 times ATTA. That would have a value of 10, meaning you'd measure it. And in your yDNA, and it's fairly inexpensive technically to do this, which is why they're popular. For a certain marker, they have names like DYS493, you would have a number 10. It means you've got 10 of these little repeating bits. Those mutate fairly quickly, father to son only. So a 10 can go down to a 9, it can go up to an 11. They only jump 1. They're very rare exceptions. So you might be chugging, and this can change. So father and son are likely to be identical in SNPs, but they can change in STRs. This is why forensics likes them, why the police have liked them. One, is fairly inexpensive, and two, they change fairly quickly, which means they're pretty much unique to the individual. So you can obviously understand for forensic things, you want as close to unique to an individual as you can get. Is that good enough? There's some trickiness to them because they mutate fast and they overwrite each other. If you're at 11, you go down to a 10, and then somebody goes back to 11, you've lost the history. So there are tricky things about them. If you really want to get serious about it, you've got to understand. Yeah. Right.
Sorry, I'm just over here talking to myself on mute.
No problem.
All right. Question from Himat. Did most of the early American colonists have 10 to 15 kids, having married a second husband or wife when the first died and the third?
Sorry, I missed the beginning. Could you start
Sure.
over? I'm sorry, I missed you.
Yep. Did most of the early American colonists have 10 to 15 kids, having married a second husband or wife if the first passed away? Is there any facts that show that, or?
I don't know. Well, I mean, one could look. I mean, there's certainly loads of databases, and there are loads of genealogies. And if you had DNA, if you had computer access, let's say to your tree, Brett, family search tree or ancestry, any of them, you could answer that question. I think probably pretty well, better than I could.
Awesome.
My guess is. I don't know. I mean, for every time that happened, I don't know. No,
Okay.
I just don't know.
Right.
But I know the average overall is about 5 children for every couple. You can do it for every man. Okay, for every man, 5 children survive to adulthood.
Okay. There are a bunch of classes on rootstech.org this year specific to early American colonists. So I would recommend you check them out. Let's do one more question, and it's from Bill.
Absolutely.
He says, I am tracking a Davis ancestral line, and the yDNA test shows many matches to another line. What conclusion can we draw from this, as there are very few Davis matches? Does that give you enough information to answer?
Well, it's I mean, from what's been said, I have to put all kinds of caveats. But remember that example I had? What was the number? I have a Kempton or something like that with a whole bunch of lows. That's the pattern. I mean, you're tempted to say NPE, right? I mean, you go with probabilities. If you have an equal number of Smiths and Joneses in your matches, your name is Smith, an equal number of Smiths and Jones, you can't tell. It could be either way. Somewhere the name got disconnected from the DNA. But if it's 1 versus 10, the odds are that the 10 names are the same, is the root line, if you will, and the other is because of some kind of NP adoption hat. But again, you'd want to dive into the dates of the DNA to see when that was. I'm assuming this is autosomal, and so I'm assuming we all have surnames. So we're not talking about that thing I was talking about. But that's the best guess.
Okay, great. The last question is, what is an NPE? We've heard that several times.
Damn, how'd that happen? My apologies. Thank you, Rhett. NPE is an awkward term, non-parental event. I think of it as when the DNA is disconnected from the surname. Now, that can be by out of wedlock, it can be by adoption, it can be perfectly benevolent, or we don't know. Any number of ways it can happen. You can get a disconnect. That's an NPE. Now, there are other ways that we don't really call NPEs that I think of, because I've worked with some Scots. I have no Scottish, but a friend is Scottish and have been involved with some of that. And like I said, a lot of Scottish history is a surname is as much a badge of allegiance or economic or political allegiance as it is paternity. So if your name is Smith and a guy comes to the door with a sword and his name is Campbell and he says, you're going to change your name to Campbell or you're going to get off the land. Well, you're going to change your name to Campbell, more or less. And that happened a lot in Scottish history. So again, the DNA gets disconnected from the surname. So there are whole kinds of reasons. And I've seen a number of studies where a reasonable estimate in our society, actually many societies, is about 2% per generation of NPEs.
Okay, great. Thank you, Rob. We appreciate your time and your expertise.
Thank you so much, Rhett.
Yeah, this has been fun. This has been a great class. I've learned a lot, and looking through the chats, I'm seeing a lot of positive stuff. So Rob, thank you. If we were in person, we would give you a round of applause. But and then just for those of you still in the class, if you weren't here at the beginning, this class has been recorded. We will post it for later consumption in the Roots Tech library. Just give us until tomorrow before that shows up. All right, thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your time at Roots Tech. We'll see you in the next class. Thank you, Rob.
Thanks, bye.